China is evolving all the time. And I think this is actually one of the key things that the West misses as well. Don't read the headline news. Don't read these statements or actions that the government take as something permanent. It's changing all the time. The Chinese party might not change, but policies change all the time. And this is exactly the opposite to the US.
This is Dr. Keyu Jin. She's a tenured professor at the London School of Economics and holds a PhD from Harvard University. Hailing from Beijing, she's an influential thought leader in the West and has taught at several elite universities, such as Yale and UC Berkeley. She's also advised and consulted for the World Bank, the IMF, and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Moving to the US at the age of 14, she spent most of her life in the West. As a result, you might expect her views to be quite westernized, especially on the topics of China, freedom, and democracy. However, instead of endorsing the typical anti-China rhetoric that we need to contain and decouple China, Dr. Jin is a fierce advocate for the exact opposite, which is that China and the West absolutely must put their differences aside and work together to solve the world's most pressing challenges. She argues we must focus on the bigger picture, beyond mere national security concerns, because our world literally depends on it. Dr. Jin's deep insights into one of the most misunderstood systems in the world will absolutely shock you, especially if you only get your information about China from Western media.
40 years ago, 70% of the wealth belonged to the state. Today, 70% of wealth belongs to the private sector, which is really the main driver of the economy. So that's a key misunderstanding.
In the West, we're taught that China's government is a dystopian dictatorship in which all power belongs to one man who controls everything, Xi Jinping. We're taught the government is completely centralized, rigid, and incapable of change, much less innovation. But if you remember one thing from today's video, let it be this insight from Dr. Jin. This is the first time in history where a developing country with only 25% of GDP per capita compared with the US is at the cutting edge of technology and leading it in many aspects. In today's video, I'm going to show you exactly how fierce competition in China has spurred a new wave of innovation. I'm going to show you why imitation has been the secret to China's innovation growth. I'm going to reveal the real reason why many Western companies fail in China. And finally, I'm going to reveal how China's government actually works. And trust me, it's nothing like you've heard from Western media. So let's talk about Chinese innovation, which surprisingly is a controversial topic in the West. Most Westerners believe the Chinese economy and its companies only got to where they are today because of IP theft, cheap labor, and the Chinese government protecting domestic companies from foreign competition. It's widely believed in Western society that China is a copycat nation and incapable of innovation and creativity. But at the same time, common sense proves that this thought is wrong. How could China transform itself from a poor agrarian economy into a global superpower with world-class tech firms in under 40 years? The answer is fierce local competition.
And in fact, one of the main reasons that China's innovation has spearheaded in these last few years is the fierce domestic competition. We're talking about tens of thousands e-commerce companies, thousands of autonomous vehicle companies, hundreds of EV companies, and it's that domestic fierce competition that is driving forward technology, and competitive collaboration is really how we ought to think about US-China economic relationships.
What's often overlooked in the West is just how fierce this competition is in China. Almost everyone knows the e-commerce giant Alibaba, but it's one of over 12,000 e-commerce companies in China. And here is where things get very interesting. Domestic Chinese companies imitating and copying each other has actually been the main driver of growth in the Chinese tech industry. Chinese tech firms relentlessly copy each other, drive each other's prices down to the ground, they deinstall each other's software, and have even sent competing companies' CEOs to the police. That's how brutal and cutthroat the domestic competition is in China. But through this chaos emerges the most robust business models and the most resilient entrepreneurs. In China, imitation fuels innovation because the competition is so fierce. Companies are constantly innovating, tweaking their business models, improving products, inventing new monetization models, and building very high barriers to entry so that you are protected. This is a stark contrast to the West, where in Silicon Valley, copying is frowned upon and you are protected through strict intellectual property laws. In China, a more limited protection of IP is not a failing of capitalism, but instead has been China's contributor to progress. But let me be clear here, Dr. Jin doesn't claim the Chinese way is superior. Instead, she simply asks that we learn from each other and acknowledge that there is more than one way. I'm not suggesting that there's some universal recipe, or that it's perfect, or that it can be easily replicated. But what we do know is that there's more than one way of making things work. And recognizing that there is some wisdom to China's approach doesn't mean endorsing all of it, but there's something to learn from each other. This is one of the attributes I like most about Dr. Jin. She recognizes that both the US and China have their strengths and both have achieved success in the tech industry, although through very different ways. Another widespread allegation is that Western corporations don't have a level playing field in China's market, and due to protectionism from the Chinese government, domestic firms have an unfair advantage over them. But again, listen to Dr. Jin calmly dismantle this belief with facts and a real-world example.
eBay used to say free is not a business model. They laughed at Alibaba's business model. eBay wanted to charge a price for sellers to list, wanted to charge a price for transaction, and Alibaba made it all free because it understood the Chinese mentality. Then everybody went onto Alibaba's platform, and then you ended up having to pay a high advertisement cost or paying more just to get higher on your search rank. And then Ali actually won over. So that's one example where the Chinese companies were very good at focusing on the local market, adapting to local conditions, and being successful.
The eBay Alibaba example is just one of many of how local Chinese firms simply understand the domestic market much better than their foreign counterparts. This is the simple explanation as to why so many foreign companies fail in China. In fact, here is a fascinating graph from Visual Capitalist, highlighting American companies that have failed inside of China. Another notable US company is Groupon, that entered the China market in 2011 and folded in just 4 years. Groupon today is just a shell company in the United States, with a market cap of only $327 million. Meanwhile, the domestic Chinese company that killed Groupon is Meituan, which today is thriving with over 90,000 employees and a market cap of over $100 billion. But what about the Chinese government? How can innovation and entrepreneurship survive in a communist state? That is the question that many foreigners have about China, because the widespread assumption is that China's government is completely centralized in its power and in true communist draconian fashion dictates everything Chinese companies can and cannot do. Additionally, it's assumed that the government is far more interested in controlling and restraining companies than it is in encouraging their autonomy, much less innovation. However, let me share with you the fascinating story of NIO and explain how the Chinese government actually functions. NIO is one of the top 3 EV companies in China. In 2018, the company was listed on NASDAQ, but just 2 years later, it was on the verge of bankruptcy. At this point, the local government of Hefei, a small town in eastern China, convinced it to move its headquarters there. The local government injected $1 billion in exchange for a 25% stake. It arranged more loans for the company, and most importantly, the local government organized an entire supply chain around NIO. It took only 1 year before NIO's production grew by 81%. Its market cap went from $4 to $100 billion, and the local government of Hefei cashed out within a year, and NIO's life was incredibly saved. Dr. Jin continues, if you are a promising tech company, local governments will move mountains to help. They will remove red tape, find you more financing, even help employees find a spouse. They are a one-stop shop, as they like to call themselves. In China, it's really this marriage between hypercharged local officials and intrepid entrepreneurs that is at the heart of its model.
Even if it is not an electoral democracy, there are mechanisms in place to keep the government in check. And most importantly, to summarize, the political centralization, economic decentralization, where the local mayors play a huge role in reforms, innovation, growth, protecting the environment, is something that's absolutely unique in the world. And with that framework, with that new unique framework, we can understand better how China is in the world trade, in technology, in innovation, and what its aspirations are in the global economic order.
You will never hear insights into China like this on mainstream media, and it's why voices like Dr. Jin are absolutely crucial to understanding the real China. Dr. Jin refers to this economic decentralization as the mayor economy, because you have local governments acting completely autonomous from the central government and playing a central role in driving business growth and innovation. This completely contradicts everything we've been taught about China's so-called one-party system. In fact, there is an ancient Chinese proverb that helps explain this concept better. 山高皇帝远. This proverb reflects how in ancient China, the central government in Beijing did not exercise direct oversight of the various subordinate local governments throughout the country and had limited influence over their local affairs. As a result, local governments had considerable autonomy. Amazingly, while China has obviously undergone a gigantic transformation since then, this still largely remains true to this day. But once again, if you're still in doubt, I invite you to consult the latest comprehensive report from the world's leading think tank for science and technology, ITIF, which published this groundbreaking study highlighting that China is overtaking the United States in innovation output. Simply read this report and it will confirm everything that I've laid out in today's video. I'll drop a link down to the report in the description down below. In conclusion, all too often we're bombarded with strong assertions that China is a dystopian one-man dictatorship where all power is completely centralized and wielded top-down, and regional autonomy and business innovation is spurred. Thanks to Dr. Keyu Jin, it's abundantly clear that these assertions are far removed from reality. It's impossible to understand China and what's really happening on the ground if you only consume mainstream Western media. It's imperative that you look beyond the headlines and seek out voices that truly understand the country. People who have lived or spent considerable time in China. People who actually know Chinese people and communicate with them regularly. And finally, people who actually speak the Chinese language. Unlike many of these so-called China experts in the West, Dr. Jin fits these requirements perfectly. But what about the future of US-China relations? Can these two superpowers learn to put their differences aside and create a better world together through innovation? I'll give the final word to Dr. Jin.
And so I think the dialogue channels have to be open, communication has to be open. The US has to recognize that if coexistence is not possible, we're in a very dangerous world. And China has a completely different political system. Its people are different. The market mechanisms combined with the government, the role of the government will look different. But there's a huge space and scope for further collaboration and competition, which is actually a really good thing. We need more competition in the US and in China.
Thank you for taking time out of your day to spend it with me here on YouTube, and I look forward to seeing you all in our future videos soon.